Hello, everyone, and welcome from a rainy day here in Atlanta today. I'm glad you all could be here with us for this important discussion. I think, as everyone knows, CCJ has two core components. We're a nonpartisan think tank and an invitational membership organization. And our core function combines those two elements. Our core function is building common ground, bringing together leaders, experts, and innovators from across ideologies, disciplines, and sectors of the field to have serious, honest conversations about tough policy challenges and discover new routes to common goals. That's what the Long Sentences Task Force was all about. When we launched it a little over a year ago, it was the sixth of what are now 8 task forces of CCJ members. And I'll submit here that it was one of the most difficult for everyone involved for several reasons. There's just the sheer scope and complexity of the policy issues involved, the often emotional, gut-wrenching nature of the conversations, especially those about the proper role of punishment in the system and the impact of race and ethnicity. And then, of course, the political context in which these conversations were happening, which grew and grew increasingly fraught as violent crime rose over the past couple of years. In fact, more than a few people said to us at the outset and throughout this effort, like, whoa, what are you guys doing? Are you nuts? Why would you take on this kind of issue in this political atmosphere? And our view, and our boards, our funders' view, and certainly the task force members' view, was that the rise in violence made the issues surrounding long sentences even more important and urgent than they were before. If the goal is to reduce violent crime, what role do long sentences play in that? What is the proper role of punishment and the other goals of sentencing relative to other ways of reducing violence? I think our co-chairs, Sally Yates and Trey Gowdy, probably said it best in their prefatory statement to the final report when they said, why would we even discuss the nation's use of long prison sentences now amidst a rise in homicide rates and legitimate public concern about public safety? Because this is exactly the time to examine what will make our community safer and our system more just. So my view is that the task force met that challenge and produced a sweeping set of findings and recommendations that deserve the attention of everyone who is seeking more safety and more justice. And so I just want to thank the task force members, and especially those on the panel today, the incredible team at CCJ, John, Liza, Aaron, Stephanie, Jennifer, Andrew, everybody who, Hannah, everybody who is involved. Certainly Abby is involved in everything here as well, for their passionate and strategic work in producing what is a research-based, actionable, politically viable roadmap for the appropriate use of long sentences in our nation. With that, I'll turn it over to our task force director, John Maki.
Great, thank you so much. Okay. So yeah, I am John Maki. I'm the director of the task force on long sentences. What I'm going to do now is give a brief introduction to the task force, its work, how we frame the task force, and then I want to get into the recommendation with some of our members today. So as Adam noted, the task force, we were convened at the beginning of 2022, and we were given two basic missions. First was to assess the impact of prison terms of 10 years or more. That was our working definition of a long sentence. We were asked to assess the impact on public safety, crime victims and survivors, incarcerated individuals, their families, staff within the criminal justice systems. And out of that assessment, we were asked to develop recommendations that will strengthen public safety and also advance justice. So to implement, to realize these two goals, the council recruited a very impressive group of leaders, co-chaired by former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates and former Congressman Trey Gowdy. And as you see here, this is a group of 17 individuals that really brought an amazing and diverse set of experiences and perspectives to the table, from research, advocacy, criminal justice leaders, policymakers, and people who have served long sentences. One of the first things we did to kind of bring all those perspectives together was to develop a set of guiding principles. Paramount in our discussion was that we wanted to make sure that our recommendations protected people's safety, kept people safe, But we saw that safety was not merely the absence of crime. It depended on a host of other things. For instance, it was important that our recommendations and our work recognize that all people deserve to be treated with dignity. That also demanded that we sought to identify and alleviate the impact of racial and other biases. We saw the need of balancing several things, including, and probably most importantly in many ways, helping all victims and survivors of crime heal from the impact of trauma, while also allowing for the possibility of redemption. Along with those, we look to balance some of the other goals that we often ask from long sentences, punishment and deterrence. To do that, we had to rely on the best data, the best research, professional expertise, and lived experience. And ultimately, again and again, we came back to a central principle that we wanted to do our part to make our criminal justice system worthy of the respect of all people.
Oh, John, could you share your slides as well? Thank you.
We're not seeing the. I'm sorry, and I thought I was sharing the slides the whole time. All right. Can you see that? All right, forgive me for that. So here are the guiding principles. I went through them. Zoom always has a fun little adventures, doesn't it? So, core of the council's mission and our guiding principles, we look to rely on the best research we could find, the best research possible. And that presented an immediate challenge. Quite simply, there's very little research on long sentences. There's a large and developing body of research on incarceration. Most of that research is looking at shorter sentences. And at the same time, research that is on long sentences, it tends to be dated and not easily generalizable. It's often focused on particular populations or aspects. Again, it's hard to kind of draw general findings from. And so because of that, we looked to fill some of those gaps, and we commissioned a bevy of publications, lit reviews on topics such as what research says about the impact long sentences have on safety. We looked at programming, what victims and survivors and people serving long sentences, how they perceive long sentences, and also our use of long sentences from an international perspective. Going over this research would be a webinar in and of itself. So let me ask my colleague, Liza Bayless, to drop a link into a short kind of two-pager that gives an overview of that research. One thing I do want to bring out, though, was a finding to kind of help close out my introduction. This is from one of our early publications. That was most of the lion's share of this work was done by my colleague Ernesto Lopez, and it's looking at the rise of long sentences over the last several years. And as you see here, people serving long sentences are becoming a growing share of our prison population. Now, importantly, that's not because people sentenced to long sentences and serving them constitute a bulk of people going into prisons. Most people who are sentenced to prison, who leave prison, are actually serving relatively short sentences, much shorter than 10 years. What this points to instead is the stacking effect of long sentences. And when people are sentenced to serve long periods of time, their numbers grow over time. They stack up. There's a sleeper effect to long sentences, and this is having a transformative impact on our prison systems. What it points to is the fact that we're not only incarcerating people who are growing older in prison and have the ailments and the needs that come with age and the costs associated with that, but we are also incarcerating a population which research shows will become statistically less and less likely to reoffend. This is called the age crime curve, and it's one of the most robust empirical findings of all criminology. I want to put some of this in a bit of an historical context. When we think about our long sentences today, we're talking really about law and policy that was mostly developed in the late 70s through the mid 90s. And during that period, the country was experiencing a long and severe and unprecedented spike in violent crime. And the use of long sentences, especially for repeat offending, drug crimes, and especially serious violent crimes, was one of the ways in which policymakers, legislators looked to respond to control violence. Significantly, and this will come up in our discussion, This is also when victim services and victims' rights were created. They were often developed right alongside of the long sentencing laws and policies we have today. And they actually bear that imprint still. Now, significantly, as we know, beginning in the 1990s, crime began to precipitously drop. And for many years, the country was experiencing a steep crime decline. And it was in that period that what really we now think of criminal justice reform was born. Most of that work was initially focused on people serving shorter sentences on low level and nonviolent crime. But in recent years, people began to focus more and more on long sentences. And that included the initial planning that led to this task force. Now, of course, in recent years, that decline in crime stopped, and crime has spiked. And all across the country, we're seeing the impact of that spike. In many states, criminal justice reform has, if not stalled, and in some places, policymakers are looking to return to the long sentencing laws and policies that their predecessors enacted 30, 40 years ago. And this rise in crime had an impact on our task force as well. In every meeting and every discussion, it haunted what we said and did. And one of the ways we try to reckon with that increase in crime and how it's impacting our nation and our body politic was to ask a question: are we merely fated in a way to return to the past, to repurpose the solutions that our predecessors devised decades ago, or can we learn from that past? Are there ways in which we can make our responses to serious and violent crime better, fairer, and more just? The implied answer in our final report is a resounding yes. There are ways we can learn. We can learn about what we learned about trauma, the overlapping of victimization and offending, and also the overall effectiveness of long sentences. These final recommendations were published in March, so not too long ago. There are 14 of them that span kind of the breadth of the criminal justice system, all the way from victim services to prison conditions. Every recommendation has a kind of a research justification, heavily cited. So for people on this webinar who like research and want to see the evidence, we did our very best to bring together the best thinking. This report in many ways is an act of synthesis, and it's a vision, as Adam said, a roadmap to address long sentences and all of the issues that they implicate. So rather than go through all the recommendations one by one, I've asked task force members to look at some of the themes and break recommendations down into those themes. Joined today by Catherine Bocanegra, Tim Head, Sam Lewis, and Ben Tucker. And as I go through the conversation, I'll do a more in-depth introduction to them. But let me first start with a broad overview of the first set of recommendations. As I noted in the guiding principles, safety, healing, and recovery were really paramount issues for us. Our first recommendation asked policymakers to prioritize funding that would look to reduce violence, to reduce victimization. Along with that, we wanted to see supporting services for victims of violent crime, and that includes victims who might have overlapping offending and victimization experiences. And we also wanted to see greater effort placed in people who are sentenced to long sentences, for people who have prior experiences of victimization and unaddressed trauma. Right. Ben Tucker, you are a 40-year veteran of the criminal justice work. You've done a bit of everything from policing to working at the federal system. And in 2014, you were in leadership in the New York Police Department, where you began your career. You actually retired in 2021, and then I think very shortly thereafter accepted an invitation to serve on this task force of long sentences. And I would love for you to kind of spend some time reflecting on, one, why this work was important to you, and in particular, why these first sets of recommendations on violence reduction and victim services is important.
Hey, John, thank you for the introduction. And if I may, I'd like to just, before I begin my formal remarks and comments, just acknowledge and thank my colleagues on the task force for their unbelievable commitment, candor, honesty, fortitude, and trust. And those who are listening and those who are joining us on the panel know what I'm talking about. This was not an easy task. We grappled with quite a bit. And as we grapple with the issue of long sentences at a time when gun violence and homicide rates are a public safety concern across the nation, as you indicated in your opening remarks and sort of setting the stage. Crime in this country has there's this ebb and flow, and it has gone up, it's come down, and now just about 2019 into 2020, we started to see it peak again. And so I want to talk a little bit about just where where I am and my interest in the both being asked to have the privilege of joining CCJ, but also to be part of the task force. And I just want to just elaborate a little bit on why, for me, my motivation to join the NYPD is implicated here because it's helped shape my interactions with police, because of my interactions with police. And I wanted to pursue justice for all. And I decided that I could do that best from inside the NYPD. And not just justice for all, but especially for justice for people who look like me. And so throughout my career, as you pointed out, it's been pretty broad, and it's actually 50 plus years now, John. I shouldn't admit that, but it is. As a policing professional and a policymaker, public safety and keeping people safe has been paramount. It's been first and foremost in the rationale for me joining the department, as I indicated. But the question and the challenge has always been how best to do that. And I think that's an ongoing question. It is not something that gets answered and then we move on. It's an iteration of the times and where we are, especially when, in my experience, crime reduction and crime prevention has been subject to the ebb and flow of social, political, and economic influences. And that cannot be ignored, and it looms large, I think, in this discussion. I recognized early on that prevention is an indispensable of two critical issues in many respects. One, because investing in interventions that are proven to reduce violence, violent crime, and at the same time, the second, acknowledging victims and survivors and making sure that they get the support that they need. And that's been, sort of my mantra, and it's been the world that I've lived in throughout these decades. And so it was important for me that in joining the task force, that our work on the task force focused on safety. That is, reducing our use of long sentences through the reduction of serious crime, and doing our best to prevent the types of crime that lead to long sentences ultimately. And of course, we can debate and should debate how long sentences should be, how long they should be, but the research, I think, is clear in that regard, and that most of people, as they age, are less likely to commit crimes, and that's an important point. And this includes people who are serving long sentences as well, so 10 years or more. And so, as I think the first recommendation that you cited, as the task force had made clear, there is opportunity, for sure, opportunity to safely decrease the length of long sentences, while also investing those resources that we save in criminal justice and community interventions. It's paramount, I think, not only in terms of the interventions, but we know through the research and the data that we've looked at that it's proven that we can reduce violent victimization as well.
Yeah.
And so importantly to that end, I would note the task force's violent crime working group that outlined those 10 recommendations. And this is especially noteworthy where they speak to the government and community leaders getting together to implement and address this issue together. And this is especially noteworthy because it's well settled that, in my view, public safety is a shared responsibility, and we can get there where we need to be. So as government leaders work with communities to implement and administer a response to serious violent crime, we need to make sure that all the victims and survivors have access to services. And I would underscore that this includes people in communities that are disproportionately impacted by violence and victimization, especially in communities of color.
Thank you so much, Ben. Let me reshare my screen and go to the next set of recommendations here. So as part of this focus on victims and survivors of violent crime and all victims of violent crime, including, as Ben Tucker noted, people who may not have been considered victims in the past, communities that have been highly victimized. We wanted to really listen to victims and kind of incorporate their perspectives into our recommendations. We heard from both people on our task force and listening sessions that we did across the country, real desire for accountability. And then included accountability with victim rights we've had since the early 80s. There was a real deep interest in from many victim survivors to engage in restorative justice opportunities, to learn to talk with people who harmed them, to understand why they did what they did, and hopefully to come to some kind of reconciliation. Victims also wanted to know more about long sentences, their impact on violent crime, their impact on communities. And again, this pointed to, I think, a real lack of research in this area. Implementation and steps included, much more evaluation work in this area, in particular around victim impact statements, looking to implement and evaluate restorative justice programs within prisons. These are programs that are mainly focused on the front end of the system, particularly around young people. There's a real interest from people we talk to learn more about or to have more opportunities for that kind of work. And lastly, we wanted to see, again, a real resounding interest in understanding better how people experience long sentences and the impact they have on people. All right, I am not sharing anymore, correct? Okay. Catherine Bocanegra, you have a really just interesting and unique professional background. I think you've done just about everything possible. In your early career, you've run violence prevention programs, community violence intervention programs. You've developed interventions and services for victims of community violence, particularly family members of people who've been murdered. You advise the Attorney General of Illinois. You've been on countless commissions in our home state, I should say. Catherine and I are both from Illinois, and most recently, you were the co-chair. You are the co-chair of Chicago's new mayor, Brandon Johnson's Public Safety Transition Committee. Catherine, given all your experience, the work you do, can you talk about what's significant and how we approach victimization, and in particular, what you think people on this webinar should take from that work?
Thank you so much, John. And similar to Ben, I would like to preface my comments with gratitude to Adam for taking on difficult topics, to our co-chairs, and to John for your flawless facilitation and your ability to incorporate such incredible research and grounded experiential wisdom into this task force. The amount of research reports and public education that's occurred around this is truly impressive. So I also then want to follow up just commending the task force for focusing on victims and survivors in its meetings and publications and the composition of its membership. There were survivors of violence survivors who had a family member murdered as part of our task force. So I want to commend CCJ and John for composing such a dynamic group of people to have these conversations, because there is a connection between sentencing policy and our response to victimization. And I have observed this to be especially true when we hear about violent injury or death inflicted on children, on innocent victims, or when violence occurs in areas presumed to be safe. Is some of the previous experience that John noted in 2015 and 2016, I supported our then governor in a criminal justice and sentencing task force with the goal of reducing our Illinois prison population by 25% in 10 years. And the task force or the commission was discussing truth in sentencing, which we know is one of the policy drivers of long-term prison sentences. And there was extensive research that was reviewed. We had experts come and talk about truth in sentencing. And at the end of all of the research presentations and this very rich dialogue, there was one of the commissioners who stood up and said, I just don't think that's fair for victims. When he was saying fair to victims, he was saying discussing reducing prison sentences for certain crimes is just not fair to those who've been impacted by it. And that comment was responded to by a fellow commissioner who said, well, what do survivors want? What do survivors want of the criminal justice system after a violent event has occurred? And so to that point, I want to highlight one of the reports that John briefly mentioned. The task force conducted a series of listening sessions that administered in both English and Spanish for victims whose cases implicated long sentences and people who had served long-term prison sentences. And this task force publication can be found on CCJ's website. It's titled Reflections on Long-Term Prison Sentences. It's excellent. Maybe it'll be dropped into the chat as well. So that just shows the grounded research as well that CCJ engaged in. So going back to that, I want to emphasize why it's critical to listen and incorporate the perspectives of victims and survivors, particularly victims and survivors, as Ben said, from low-income communities of color where serious violence and victimization is disproportionately concentrated. Just to highlight some of the things from my background that John mentioned, I've worked for 18 years in community mental health and community violence prevention, working with families of homicide victims for 13 years, and for the last 4 years supporting the Illinois Attorney General on crime victims and violence prevention related issues. And there is a big question mark around what do survivors want after an incident of violence, what makes them feel safe, and what helps them heal. Those questions are embedded in any sentencing policy conversation, and especially when we're talking about long-term prison sentences, because they're most frequently associated with a violent event. And I've observed in task forces and sentencing policy discussions, and even in scholarly forums, that victims' voices and experiences are often marshaled in ways that is inconsistent with how they articulate what they need to heal and what they need to feel safe after a violent event. So the recommendations from the report, I think, drill down into this gap in knowledge and research and in practice around what do survivors need to heal and to feel safe, and how is this connected to our discussion of long-term prison sentences. I have sat with families of homicide victims, again, for over 13 years and observed their interactions with prosecutors, and they are often told that justice will be delivered the longer someone spends in prison. And families subsequently tether their hopes for some sense of respite to the promise of punishment. But what happens when punishment is not delivered? What happens to their healing? What happens to their sense of safety? And then also what happens to all the families when that promise of justice is never even on the table? Because we know from the research that violent crime is severely underreported, and among the incidents that are reported, very few arrests and convictions can result. To that effect, there's a story that I often like referencing to highlight how valuable the recommendations from the report are, which the story includes the mother of a homicide victim who came to a support group after her son was killed in a drive-by shooting at an afternoon baseball game in the community. There were 23 witnesses who were willing to stand trial. She was told by the prosecutor, this person is going to die in prison. This is a sealed case. And without going into detail of the court proceedings, that person walked out. The person who was on trial for the murder of her son was not found guilty and walked out of the courtroom a free man that day. And that mother, who had been offered this promise of healing and safety through punishment, went home that night and attempted suicide because she had channeled all of her hope and expectations of safety and healing into this promise of punishment. Thankfully, a family member found her. Thankfully, she was brought to the hospital, and thankfully, I got to know her. And it highlights how when only one thing is offered to survivors, it can leave a huge gap in terms of their safety and their restoration and community safety, more broadly. So to kind of wrap up these, my reflections here, the task force's prioritization and orientation of survivors' perspectives and experience is one of the unique strengths of the report, primarily the accountability and access through the enforcement of victims' rights, which to me is a call for increased access to victim services first and foremost. Think about the mother of the son who was playing baseball, right? She did not have access to services and only one thing was offered to her. And we see how that tremendously impacted her life and her family's life. In addition to that, the provision of restorative justice opportunities for survivors and the people serving long-term prison sentences is also an exemplary recommendation, because from the research that I've done, from the report that CCJ has published, and from the community practice that I come from, what we have learned is that what survivors need is answers. They want to know why them, why their child, why their loved one, and that they recognize that no sentence length will bring back the loved one that they lost, and no sentence length will reverse what has happened. So the only way to move forward from their perspective is through restorative dialogue and healing and getting answers to these questions that burden them after their victimization.
Right.
So I want to thank John for creating this space and highlight those recommendations from the report.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And let me return to the slides here. Again, everyone can see those. Sorry. Somehow I've never learned how to do to share a slide very effectively. So moving on to recommendations that address the sentencing aspect of long sentences, how long sentences come to courts. So really concerted focus on empowering, structuring judicial decision-making to help individualize sentences, not simply to punish crimes, but to punish or to sentence individuals, and to consider the facts and circumstances that accompany and lead to offending. Again, paramount to this, I noted in the guiding principles, was a focus threaded throughout our recommendations on identifying and alleviating unwarranted racial disparities, giving judges a power, the structure to consider relevant facts and circumstances. And I think one of the more important recommendations to once a person reaches a 10-year sentence in prison, to place presumptive limits on how criminal history can increase a person's incarceration. In terms of implementing these recommendations, as I noted in my introduction, trying to bring together really the best thinking around this. So this involves an increased and more robust use of safety valves, and developing proposals, ways of understanding ahead of time how long sentences impact racial minorities through demographic impact statements and racial impact notes. Tim Head, you are the leader of Faith and Freedom, one of the nation's leading conservative advocacy organizations. You've done work across the country in criminal justice reform, particularly at the federal level, the First Step Act. And apart from your work in politics and the conservative movement, you're also a social worker. So I'd love for you to kind of, from your perspective, particularly as a conservative leader, help us understand what's important about these recommendations. And in particular, are there recommendations, are there kind of strands of thought here that can appeal to your fellow conservatives and also moderates and bring people together around change that we can accomplish?
Yeah, good question, John, and you know, certainly we'll start by aligning myself with you know, previous comments from Ben and Catherine, and you know, Sam hasn't gone yet, but we've certainly had opportunities to chat over the last year, a little over a year now. That you know, I think that it's important. You know, I've come to use this word earnest a lot. That I think it's important for us to earnestly try to grapple with a lot of legitimate problems or challenges that are facing, you know, our country in this moment. I think every era or kind of generation of Americans are kind of faced with slightly unique challenges, and I would argue that certainly challenges specifically to the justice system are among the most problematic challenges that we're seeing right now. But I would even kind of scale out even slightly more broadly to say that the erosion of trust in general public institutions may be one of the most challenging problems that we're facing right now. That generally speaking, most people just don't trust any number of large institutions, and so that, you know, that has implications for, you know, the media and how we collect information for our, you know, what I'm going to pack for my suitcase if I'm traveling for the next 3 days. If I can't trust the forecasts, you know, that becomes challenging. Or if I can't trust the school system that my kids are going to, or if I can't trust the bridges that I'm driving over to, you know, to go from one place to the next. Airline systems, well, that certainly has implications for the justice system in really concrete ways. If people don't believe, for instance, or don't trust either the quickness or the effectiveness of, say, police coming, they're less likely to call 911 whenever there's some sort of dangerous situation. They may take matters into their own hands, and you know, so it's really important for us. For all of us, not just, you know, you asked the question, John, about kind of, you know, what would I say to some of my conservative friends or colleagues, but I would argue that it's actually incumbent on all of us to work earnestly together to try to solve these problems. You know, I think one of the neat things that happens kind of on the way to Rome, so to speak, in this endeavor is when earnest people, sincere people from across the political spectrum and from across the geographic map across the country and different, you know, kind of urban or rural contexts and racial and ethnic contexts, worldview, et cetera. I think that one of the really neat and encouraging things that tends to happen is that we see each other as all trying to kind of build, so to speak, towards a more perfect union. And so I think that's one of the most important kind of elements or byproducts of an exercise like this. And so it's been a privilege and an honor for me to be a part of it. I think that one of the common threads in the 3 or 4 recommendations that you just alluded to here a moment ago, you know, I think the unwanted disparities in racial and ethnic communities goes to that overall general trust in a system, right? And for that matter, in a culture broadly. If whole swaths of our population feel marginalized, or for many contexts even targeted, either targeted or maybe ignored, depending on the context, then you know, yet again, I think that you kind of see a splintering of the entire system, or kind of a fragmentation of the entire system. And so, you know, one of the challenging situations, the federal Sentencing Commission, and then also a study by the Sentencing Project from 2 or 3 years ago speaks to that. You know, at this point, about 46% of those that are serving long sentences, again, this 10 years plus, are African American, and that obviously is significantly out of kind of balance with national demographics. And so we have to to try to drill down on exactly what's happening in our sentencing kind of phases, that people that are committing similar offenses or categories of offenses are actually being sentenced to significantly longer sentences if they're of a particular ethnicity, which, you know, again is a challenge. One other, you know, quick thing that I think is worth highlighting in this is the need for systems for us from a public policy perspective to allow judicial discretion through these processes. When we build kind of stacking elements or enhancement elements into sentencing mechanisms on the state and or federal levels, we can see kind of disproportionately long sentences kick in for a second or maybe a third of offense, even if the second and third offense are relatively minor. If a first offense is a significant offense, but a second offense is relatively minor, the compounding effect of that of enhancement could mean that, you know, if shoplifting was your first offense, you may have a 3-year sentence. But if shoplifting were to be a second offense, you know, that could be a 15-year offense, sentence. And you know, so it's important for judges to be able to, for fact finders, if you will, to be able to kind of assess specific individualized cases, either the facts of the case itself or individualized kind of life circumstances to determine more precise, we'll just call it more precise sentencing versus kind of broad sweeping public policies that really don't contemplate nuances that I think all of us probably recognize that in the world of human conflict, we can have broad categories, but we actually find that individual relationships and conflicts all have, you know, they're all different shades of gray, so to speak. And so we need to be able to have the ability to allow for that in our sentencing structures.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. Again, let me share my screen and we'll close out the recommendations here, get the discussion. So our last set of recommendations really focus on the back end of our justice system, deep end of our prison systems. And again, looking at some of the traditional ways of long sentence release or release. We're looking at parole. You know, I think it's often feels like if you're a reader of research and the discussion that, you know, our system is a system of deterrent sentencing. Most of our systems use parole, including parole and people serving long sentences. Our task force looked at the power of sentence credit, incentivizing participation in programming. There's also, you know, again, most of the stuff we're looking at is been around for a while, but there's a new body of law that I'm sure most people on the webinar are aware of. Second looks, something that the task force also endorsed as an interesting and kind of promising development for people serving long sentences. And finally, and maybe even most importantly in many ways, we want to make sure that people who are serving long sentences have access to educational, vocational, and other kinds of opportunities. One, to kind of show that they've been rehabilitated, but also to become themselves a living example of change. And so I want to go now to Sam Lewis to talk about this. And again, Tim kind of noted this. I think I don't want to suggest any one member was the star of the show, but Sam, I'll just say personally, I learned so much from you throughout the task force. You are the leader of Anti-Recidivism Coalition, one of the nation's leading criminal justice reform organizations. In that work, you work to improve conditions and programs for people in California, but you also had served a long sentence and were sentenced to life with parole. And what I loved about how the perspective you brought, some moderate, kind of a centrist view of how people can come together around laws and policies that make us safe, but honor redemption, honor the possibility of change. And so I'd love for you to help close this panel out by reflecting on what you think is important about these recommendations and even the task force as a whole.
John,
There's an audio problem here. Yeah, it's still. You maybe try. Yeah, it's all. Let me do some quick problem solving, Sam. Is it possible maybe you can call in even, and then we can answer a panelist question, and you can close us out? I think it's the speaker is just not working.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, perfect. Yes.
Okay, all right. Technical difficulties. So want to echo what my esteemed colleagues all said, to bring together this diverse group of people from different perspectives to wrestle with challenging these are some really challenging issues that we work together on with a spectrum of people that cover I believe at least every perspective when we talk about our criminal justice system. And with that said, I want to say that I found new friends that I never thought we'd be able to like bridge that divide, but and have a huge amount of respect for the different perspectives. With that, I want to preface what I'm going to say with this. I believe, as a person who served a total of 24 years in prison, I believe in accountability. I believe in the ability for most people to change if given the opportunity to do so. And I also believe that there are two different levels of accountability. There's what I call state accountability, which is where you're arrested and you're taken into a facility and you're tried, you're convicted, and you serve time. That's what I call state accountability. You're being held accountable. But what I call true accountability is when you begin to look within yourself and ask yourself, why did you do what you did that led you to where you're at? And then you begin to ask, was it right? Should I have done something different? Why did I do that? And you begin to question your moral compass and you want to change that. That's when you begin to hold yourself accountable. And that's something that the state can't do by just putting you in an institution. But what the state can do is provide the resources necessary for you to begin that introspection or looking deeper within yourself. And so when board, like one of our first areas, professionalizing assessments and rehabilitation when considering a person that goes before the board. These are pieces that I think are important because without self-accountability, in my opinion, I don't think a person can change. When I first went in the system and I was being held accountable, I blamed everyone else. And until I looked within myself and started asking myself, why am I here and what caused me to make these choices? Ultimately, they were my decisions and my choices. And I had to hold myself accountable and ask myself, how do I become a better person? And in doing so, one of the things that I found while inside and as I've been doing this work now in the community for 12 years, resources have to be available across the spectrum. And when I say resources, for instance, there's an incredible program called the Victims Offenders Education Group, where people who've lost loved ones through violent crime meet with people who've committed these crimes, and they find a way to heal. It's a level of accountability because in these classes, you have to face what you've done. And so having that resource and being able to sit across from someone who lost a loved one to violent crime, you begin to ask yourself the question. It's hard for you not to. And so when we look at these different things, one of the things what happens when we incentivize rehabilitative programming inside, it creates something that I've seen in Norway or what they call the Scandinavian model. It begins to create what you call dynamic security. And dynamic security is this. It creates hope, and that hope creates a level of safety or a culture shift that creates safety, not just for the people that are incarcerated, but for the staff that work in these facilities. And as you shift that culture, you begin to start having accountability through the population. And the population, like me, if I were to use myself as an example, when I began to make that change, I was able to get other people that were incarcerated to begin to look within themselves. And those people were able to get other people. And then you started having a shift where everybody wanted to become the best version of themselves. And what this does ultimately, when a person's released, it actually enhances public safety, because now you've righted your moral compass, you've held yourself accountable, and when you re-enter society, you're able to understand those are not things that are acceptable in the norm, so to speak. And you begin to have this influence amongst peers that may be coming home, or that may have seen you as the guy that was in the neighborhood doing the wrong things. Now they want to do the right thing. And so you're enhancing public safety. You're not committing more crimes. You have a positive influence in the community. And these are intangibles, but they're intangibles in the sense that if you think about a gang leader that's in prison that decides to no longer be involved with gangs and comes home, and the people that had followed him at one time or another see the changes that he's made, what happens to them? They begin to see those changes and say, I want to become part of something that's greater than myself, that's better than this gang. And you begin to have this cultural shift. And so when you give those opportunities to people that are inside, you begin to set up an entirely different ecosystem inside the facilities. And as I described it as dynamic security. And the other part is making sure even people that are sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, they should have access to rehabilitative programming, because again, we want to create safer environments inside these facilities, not just for the people that are incarcerated, but the staff that are working in there. And as people change, you never know what can happen. If we look at it from these statistics, 95% of people that are incarcerated will come home from incarceration. How do we want them to come home from incarceration? Do we want them to come home better, the best version of themselves? Do we want them to come home and to be able to enhance public safety and have hope in these facilities that maybe one day I will have an opportunity to come home? It's not guaranteed. I have to earn it. I have to change. I have to look within myself. This is on me to become the best version of myself. And in some instances, that might not happen because there's still that 5% that won't come home. But because I want to become the best version of myself, I'll do that where I'm at. But being able to provide those resources also influences the people that will be coming home. 54% of people that are incarcerated for violent crimes. And so if we think about that, you're going to have people that are coming home. I was incarcerated for a violent crime. The only thing that I've done since I've been released is give back to my community, try to figure out ways to stop violent crime from happening, how to influence people to be positive role models, how to shift the paradigm inside facilities and help people become the best version of themselves. And I'm not unique. There are other people that want to help do these things. And we work with survivors of violent crime. We believe in the healing aspects of restorative justice and helping people be able to move on, but with accountability at the forefront of this. And so these recommendations, when we look at the bios of the people that were on this task force, who I consider my friends now, this is incredible. And I think we should continue to look at initiatives like this and bringing together incredible minds, different experiences from across different sectors to be able to understand how do we make our system better and how do we make our community safer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sam. So we have about 5 minutes, and I'd love to get into some of the great questions we have here. There's one question, a really good one. I want to ask. Or a person wrote in noting that concern that some of the reliance on community programming, prison programming, the research behind that program is often not as strong as we would like. It's maybe more mixed. And I think, at the task force, we tried really hard not to over rely on one evaluation and to take an honest look at the efficacy of what we know about the efficacy of programs. But I'd love to open this up. What do you, based on kind of last year of work we've all done, how do we think, what should we do as a criminal justice system, as a people, in terms of looking to use long sentences effectively, fairly, and justly, and also developing programs that maybe right now don't have a strong evidence base? Catherine?
Okay, I'll take a first stab just because I have something right in front of me that partially answers your question. So related to community-based programs and their potential to reduce violence. For the first time ever, there's been a randomized controlled trial study, which, you know, is like kind of the gold standard of research on the effectiveness of community violence intervention work and its potential to reduce violent victimization and perpetration. So that study was done on Ready Chicago out of Heartland Alliance. And the University of Chicago Urban Labs conducted that RCT, and they've publicized some of the results. So I'd like to highlight that and showing that from the most rigorous research design possible, they're showing that a comprehensive community-based violence intervention strategy, yes, has the potential to reduce violent victimization and perpetration. And then there was also a really wonderful report that came actually from John J. I know you're reading this backwards on the screen, but I'll just say it: Reducing Violence Without Police, a review of research evidence. There are some members of actually CCJ's Task Force on Violence Reduction that were authors in this report that gives a very wide review of different studies and the research evidence behind community-based violence reduction strategies. So that's a partial response to, I think, the question that was posed.
Absolutely. There's another question, actually, we only have a few minutes and I want to see if I can get to it, about how we thought about, and Sam, I think this kind of was in your comments, how did the task force, how did we consider the transformative impact of parole and discretionary release itself? And I think what the question is maybe asking is, are there ways in which people, and again, I'm thinking, Sam, particularly of you, can themselves be kind of an ambassador for the reforms that we want to see?
Absolutely. I think, so for instance, one, we want to make sure that we put our resources where we need them most. And so for instance, when I came home and I was on parole and my parole agent would come in and check in with me, he literally told me, like, it's kind of a waste of time to come check on you. I know where you're at. I know where you work at. I've checked on you multiple times. And so utilizing the voices of agents that are on the ground to be able to say, you know what, based on my 10, 15, 20 years as a parole agent, I think I should focus more of my attention on this person or these people on my caseload. And the other part that I've learned, one of the things that we've done in California, which I think is amazing, is parole officers have now become the success of a person that's on parole demonstrates the effectiveness of the parole officer, because that parole officer will make sure that the person is plugged into resources as they're released prior to being released from the institution. And so if you think about bridging those resources, again, making sure a person has housing, making sure a person has a employment track, making sure all of these things that are necessary to successfully complete parole, but more importantly, to make sure that you don't recidivate or don't commit new crimes, parole plays an important part in that. And making sure that it's not a punitive supervision, but a supervision that helps a person transition from incarceration to society in a way that's safe for everyone that's involved.
Thank you. So we're really near the top of the hour. I want to make sure everyone respectful of people's time. I want to thank the task force members, Catherine Bocanegra, Tim Head, Sam Lewis, Ben Tucker. We'll thank everyone who joined us today. Also note, again, the report goes into a lot of depth and detail. Questions we couldn't get to, I would look to the report, especially look to the footnotes. We did our very best to cite all of the most up-to-date and relevant research, and hopefully that report and the research that we commissioned will be an ongoing resource for policymakers, advocates, and for people who care about long sentences. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Good to see you, Sam. Good to see you, Benjamin.
There you have it.
Yeah, I think
Appreciate it, guys.
yeah, appreciate you. Thank you.
Always good to see you.
Absolutely.